And I would like for our public, if you could just elaborate very briefly, or however it comes to you, how did this book came about?
Well, of course, there were many elements that brought it about. One of them was I've been on commissions, admissions committee for Harvard Medical School, Tufts Medical School, residency training for many years. And I always ask people, what book did you read that inspired you to become a psychiatrist? And for a while, people had all kind of interesting things. And then for the last decade or so, the residents had no book they referred to. They said, the DSM inspired me. And I got like, the DSM inspired to become a psychiatrist? Like, that's pretty weird. And I remember very vividly as a student how I read a bunch of books, like I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, or Man's Search for Meaning, that had a deep impression on me and made me want to become a psychiatrist. And I thought, I should write a book that if you are a student, that you think, this is the most interesting thing to do with your life, I'm going to become a psychiatrist.
Wow.
Yeah.
So mostly this book was inspired in the people who were gonna become psychiatrists.
Yeah, among other people, but it's very much that. What I also found is that the world of clinical wisdom and the world of research was getting more and more separated from each other, and people were sitting in their laboratories, getting money to study things, and people were doing clinical work, and the two of them weren't talking to each other, and what people were learning clinically was not really affecting the researchers, and what the researchers were finding was not affecting the clinical practice. And so, being both a researcher and a clinician, I thought it would be really interesting to really show what we have learned in order to get our field to stop being stuck in the same old understanding, figuring out way, and to really say, now this is what we have learned about the brain and about brain development, and that's what it means, how we can help people.
I understand. Very nice. You write that this is also a guide, an invitation, and a longing to dedicate ourselves to facing the reality of trauma. Can you talk about this, facing the reality of trauma? What did that meant for you at the time of writing your book?
You know, it's interesting and also very relevant to Spain and Latin America, in that when I was a student, nobody ever talked about domestic violence, nobody talked about rape, nobody talked about child abuse. It was not on the map. And then we were working with soldiers, and so we defined PTSD. And we said, it's an extraordinary event outside of ordinary human experience. And then we started to look, and we got like, there's nothing unusual about these events. A quarter of all women get molested in their lives. A quarter of all people get beaten up by their parents. A third of all couples engage in violence in their relationships. There is nothing extraordinary about it. And but see, so what we really were confronted with is the extraordinary issue that psychiatry, psychology has systematically ignored the impact of horrendous life experiences, which are central to the genesis of so much psychopathology.
This is so amazing. So, in other words, you're saying that leading a good life when one has a secure place where to grow, healthy relationships filled with respect for one another, are preventing trauma? Are they protecting some kind of foundation pillars that would protect us in our mental health in the future?
Well, so, the interesting issue is that if anybody who has more than one child knows, we come into the world with different temperaments. And of course, these temperaments shape a lot of stuff. But what people haven't really looked at is if you're chronically scared as a kid, if you are afraid to be beaten up, if you're being molested as a kid, this has a major effect on development of the mind and the brain. And for reasons that still puzzle me, psychiatry has almost always neglected that. And in fact, the people who don't neglect it tend to come to very bitter ends in academia.
So it means like the system is medicalized in a way. Is that what you want to say?
Well, I don't think that focusing on trauma is necessarily
Um,
medicalizing.
exactly, exactly.
Hey, Lisha, hold on for a sec.
Sure.
Lisha, I love you to sing, but
Okay, we can go ahead.
okay. So what really emerged was something that we now call developmental psychopathology, and that is really certainly not me alone. I mean, there's many other people in the world who study this, the effect of different experiences at different stages of development, and how that affects the brain, and how it affects the mind, and how it affects who you are, identity, etc., etc. And that really is, strangely enough, sort of a new understanding about human development. That until sort of Bowlby started to look at the attachment bond, and when Bowlby did that originally, he was pilloried by English psychiatrists, like, oh no, the environment has nothing to do with it. So there was really a concerted effort to say that the way you raise your child has no impact on how your child ends up. Which is very strange, isn't it?
It makes no sense, really. Yes. So I really was very impressed with your book, and especially when you bring the word trauma as a public health issue. Could you talk about how
Well,
trauma needs to come to the awareness of people in governments, in educational system,
well,
in healthcare?
so in our small studies, we really were able to show how drug addiction is highly correlated with child abuse, and how self-destructive behavior is highly correlated with child abuse. But the big study was, of course, the A study, Vince Felitti, of 17,000 people who had insurance in San Diego, that really spelled out how pervasive trauma is, how it affects all kind of organ systems, how it affects identity, how it affects self-destructive behavior. And actually the notion that it's the biggest public health issue came from Robert Anda, who was the statistician on Felletti's study, who the first time he ever presented the A study at the conference that I was at, he sat next to me and presented his data, and he started to cry. And he said, I'm a statistician, I'm a tobacco researcher. And here I sit in front of my computer, and gradually what emerges is the biggest public health issue in America that accounts for at least 50% of all health issues, and how profoundly the effect of early childhood trauma affects all kind of brain, mind, and body issues.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So people begin to read your book, and there's so many comments, so many reactions, especially from people who finally understand themselves and what has happened to them, regardless of where they come from in society, in many countries in around the world. And your book is scientific based, but also bringing a clinical awareness in order to break silence. This is an important concept, breaking the silence. Could you talk about this?
Well, I think the science is very important, and certainly I very much come from the science angle. I was trained in a very scientific program, and I've always done research, and I've always been part of the neuroscience research of how the brain develops and how the brain organizes self-experience, and so what we really learned in very great detail is how brain development is affected by the quality of people's attachment relationships and by terror, and how normal human functioning really depends on your having experiences of safety and belonging and truth and justice early on in your life. And if that doesn't happen, you are likely to develop very serious maladaptations, to become chronically angry, to become chronically frightened, to put it in your body and have a lot of physical complaints. And indeed, as Felitti showed, it is the most expensive public health issue in America and probably in the world, in that trauma interferes with the capacity to learn, the capacity to form friendships, to collaborate with people. So it has a very pervasive impact on our societies.
So breaking the silence is bringing this to the surface of the awareness.
Right, I think that's true. I think, it's also, of course, important that we are having this interview the day before the elections in America, which is not a minor issue. And I think the elections in the way around the world right now are about, do we recognize the reality of people's lives, or do we continue to go with uncontrolled profit making on the part of corporations, regardless of the effect it has on people? And I think to a large degree that is what the current political tensions are about. Are we going to pay attention to the quality of life that people have, or are we going to continue to ignore it and put our resources in making rich people richer? And do we ignore what effect poverty and deprivation has on poor people? So you cannot ignore the political dimensions of all of this.
Yes, absolutely. Can't agree more with you. And going back to the title of the book, you speak, the body keeps the score. Has the body been the elephant in the room of mental health care?
Right. Well, so very gradually, as we're doing this work, you see it first of all when people walk into your office. The moment that you are in a waiting room or somebody walks into your office, you oftentimes have a pretty good impression of what you're dealing with, because the way that people move, the way that people organize themselves, the way that people focus really immediately gives you an impression this person isn't fully here, and that their bodies seem to be locked up and frozen, and so slowly I got to really understand that frightened people live in frightened bodies, and angry people live in angry bodies. And then with all the science we've done in the last 30 years, we get to see how this is really expressed in hormonal excretions and body excretions and immunological issues, that if you are in a chronic state of mental anguish or mental fear, it affects how your body organizes itself. And actually the feedback comes from your body. That the way that you know that you're terrified or angry or upset is because you have these heartbreaking or gut-wrenching sensations in your body. And so the body really gives you the signals of distress and anger and rage. And then when you can't stand those, you will do anything to make those feelings go away, including very much drinking, drugging, starving yourself, and doing something to try to manage that sensory world inside of you.
Exactly. So the body becomes crucial in the awareness of how, as the profession in mental health develops, how the bottom up and top down approaches need to be integrated.
I say we are bodies.
We are bodies.
I'm in Northern European by origin, so I'm naturally inclined to be disembodied as anybody. And yet, you cannot get away from the fact that if you feel upset, you feel it in your body and it affects your body in profound ways. And so what I have been struck by is how the body was very long ignored in psychiatry. It still is being ignored in psychiatry. And the people who work with the body tend to be people who are somewhat disreputable.
Do you have any idea why is this reputation for body workers or body therapists?
In our world, this puritanical Northern European world that I come from, which is different from your world, although your world has its own problems.
Yeah, we have. But in my world, we want to copy your world, which I don't know if it's good or bad.
You can keep copying all the bad.
And we get it wrong anyway.
But there's an old tradition in Northern European countries. It to ignore the body and to get all philosophical and heady and to ignore whatever else is going on. And there's also a surprising confusion about sensuality. And certainly in, again, European and North American culture, we have had very difficulty feeling comfortable with and celebrating our sensuality. And it's very hard for us to distinguish between pleasure and sensuality and assault and bad things.
Yeah.
And so now
transgressing the other person or whatever.
And now we have this curious roles that as a teacher, you're not allowed to touch your students. Mm-hmm. But that's unnatural. When you deal with little kids, of course you put your hands on their shoulder. And putting your hands on the kid's shoulder is not the same as sexual intercourse. And I think, I'm not totally opposed to psychotherapists really staying with thinking and noticing things. But at the end, you cannot ignore the body and the fact that the body needs to be held and touched and feel safe. And so if we don't get trained to help people feel safe in their bodies, we better find other people who can do that with us or the people we work with.
Yeah, it's like...
So for me, Peter Levine and Pat Ogden and El Peso, all body workers, and Rolfing and Feldenkrais were enormously important people who really helped me to understand the profundity of effects of working with the body. But of course, we never could find money from research institutions to help us to do the necessary research to really go there.
Yes, I understand, and I really appreciate all the attention you give in your book on how the body is like the vehicle for relationships, the vehicle for emotions, the vehicle for finding oneself. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. And then you give a great deal of attention on how attachment theory it needs to be re-understood and reprocessed and reassessed in mental health care, or at least from a patient's point of view or a clinician point of view.
Well, yeah, it's again one of these things that astounds me, is that I ask people when I speak to groups, have you ever heard of Dante Cicchetti? Dante Cicchetti is the founder of developmental psychopathology. I hardly ever meet anybody who has heard of him. Dante is alive and well, and for us has been a profound inspiration with his very good scientific work on the impact of trauma on peer relationships and biological functioning and mental processing, etc., etc. And again, it astounds me how in academic programs where people teach about psychopathology and people teach about treatment, the issue of developmental psychopathology is barely mentioned. And, people generally do not know all the very important work that has been done that shows how the way that you're being held and being treasured as a 2-year-old has a dramatic impact on how you live your life at age 18 and at age 40. And these longitudinal studies have been done, but somehow both psychology and psychiatry just keep dissociating that reality off.
Yes,
Right?
to the extreme of not getting results with their clients, possibly.
Right. Right. And of course, but maybe part of the reason why psychology and psychiatry have had so hard time with it is because once you realize that the environment plays such a gigantic role in the psychopathology of ourselves and the people we deal with, then we need to actually change our social environment.
Exactly.
And once you start becoming a revolutionary, of course, you're likely to end up in the guillotine. So,
Let's
so,
not go there.
so it's very hard
Yeah,
to honestly face the reality of the people we work with, and not and then it's very hard to translate it into political activity because
of
it really
course.
means that we need to make help really people help raising their kids, create optimal conditions for parents, create optimal conditions for kids, and it really means a reordering of our social systems.
Yes, your book is like a word of mouth presentation of how to humanize relationships, how to humanize clinical treatments, and how to go beyond the talking cure, also, right?
Yeah.
How
Well,
talking is
but-
not only the only way to help another person.
yeah. But I want to say something about the talking cure,
Yes,
because
please.
because I was raised, my own training was very much talking. Huh? And so when I wrote my book, I sort of said, well, talking is important, but let's pay attention to other things. But then I started to realize that young students these days don't get trained in talking nearly as well as I was trained, and aren't really trained to really sit with people to help them to find language for their internal experience and to really dig and take your time to allow people to develop a language for themselves. And now, 5 years after the book is out, although I like my chapter about language quite a bit, I would even more say, yes, language is very important.
Of course it is, yes.
And so it's not like just pay attention to the body. No, having language for yourself, knowing who you are, being able to articulate what you feel like and what's happening inside of yourself, and getting a narrative is terribly important also.
Yeah, it's like a both and what I hear you say.
Yeah.
Yes, but at the time of writing your book, it seems like the body was not taking into account into assessments,
Right.
into treatment design, and to humanizing the person.
Yeah.
There's a part of your book where you talk about one of your teachers, what that you ask him, is this person a schizoid or a schizophrenic? And the teacher, Elvin Semrad, said, no. Well, I wouldn't, think I like to call him Michael McIntyre, which is like a huge teaching for everybody, for all of us working
Yeah,
with people.
so part of, we all have our own trajectories, but so part of my own trajectory is that I happen to, because of an accident of history, to be somewhat involved in the creation of the DSM. And at that time, when we were very much hoping that drugs would give important answers, we thought the DSM would really change our capacity to understand people. 30 years later, 40 years later, we know that the DSM probably has done more harm than good, in that we now have these false categories that really don't tell us very much. And they're categories that are really divorced from people's mental capacities and their background.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I think this is worth talking about, because this is where I think your book is leading to, right? Encouraging people to find new paths for recovery of
Yeah.
trauma
Well,
and
recovery and prevention. Huh?
recovery and
So,
prevention.
so part of it is to really think about how are we raising kids, what do our school systems look like, are kids being taught to regulate themselves? One of my dreams is that in every school in the world, people will teach 4 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and self-regulation, and that self-regulation becomes a part of what we all are being taught in our cultures. How you can calm yourself down, what happens in the brain when you lose it, what happens in the brain when you become upset, how can you use your breathing and your movement and your singing and your language to actually regulate yourself.
And is regulation a product of co-regulation?
And of course, regulation is co-regulation because, again, something that wouldn't come naturally to people in Spain or Greece, but is very much an American thing. In America, people think that we are all individuals and that we have our own destiny in our hands. Nobody in the world has ever thought that. Up to the time America came along, people always saw themselves as part of another, of a culture, of a tribe, of a village, or of a family. And it's this notion that we are these individuals that are completely independent of our environment is a newfangled American notion that, of course, doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Exactly. Yes, yes. Amazing. And when you talk to the trauma survivors, you say overcoming trauma is becoming the owner of your own life. Could you
Right.
elaborate about this?
Yeah. So some of my language here, actually, I learned from Pierre Janet, a very old French psychiatrist from more than a century ago, um, who first pointed out that once you get traumatized, you become fearful of memories. You become fearful of knowing. And so you try not to feel, you try not to know. And so you wall it off and you isolate it and you try to go on with your life by pushing that stuff away. But pushing that stuff away takes an enormous amount of energy. And you use that energy to squash your fear and your terror and your rage, and there's very little capacity left at the end. So you have very little energy to go on with your life. And as Janelle already pointed out, unless the trauma has been laid to rest, you don't have the energy to do anything else. So you need to deal with the trauma. And as long as you don't deal with the trauma, you are budding at a very small part of your capacities because keeping it under wraps takes too much energy. And that's really what brought us into these new treatments. And we really do have ways, although hypnosis also can do that, of helping people to confront what happened to them back then, to make it safe for them to know, yes, this is what happened to me, this is how it affected me, this is what's going on in my life, and this is how I can deal with it now. And so indeed, I think we have a long way to go because this is all a very young field. It's only 30 years old, and I'm sad to see how many people say I found the answer. No, you haven't found the answer. You have found a piece of the answer.
Exactly.
And so this is all an evolving consciousness, an evolving awareness, and we are very much in the process of learning.
Yeah, and one of the things I saw your book doing is bringing all this together with some research you've done with people, with actual people who have been trauma survivors, and where you demonstrate by the research how there's a positive result and reactions when people receive these kind of help and change this kind of narratives in their life. Is this correct? Am I
Oh,
understanding properly?
absolutely. No, and that also means that you really need to confront your ignorance. That there's a tendency among psychologists, psychiatrists, to be very religious people. And they study Freud and they say, oh, Freud is the answer. And they study Jung and say, Jung is the answer. And they study EMDR and say, EMDR is the answer. And they study neurofeedback and say, neurofeedback is the answer. No, or polyvagal theory is the answer. No, none of these things are the answer. All these things have something to contribute to help us understand a very complex picture. And so we need to really be very selective. Or we can use that, and we can use that, and we can use that. But we need to become very good in many different things.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And how about reprocessing the past, letting go of the past?
Yeah.
How does this happen, or why is it important in the picture of trauma treatment?
Oh, so fundamentally, being traumatized means that something gets broken. And what gets broken is that something in your brain doesn't allow you to know that this is over. This belongs to the past. So the nature of PTSD is that you continue to experience the past as if it's happening now. And so what we need to do is to activate the brain circuits that make it possible for people to say, yep, this happened to me, not to deny it, not the fact that it was better than it was, say, that is horrendous, and it happened to me when I was 3 years old, or it happened to me when I was 18 years old. And so you need to activate these brain circuits that allow you to get a sense of time and to know that today is November 2nd, 2020, and it's not
Back
July
then.
1953 when this terrible stuff happens. And that breaks down when you're traumatized. And telling people you shouldn't think about the past doesn't help them.
Okay.
It has to do with the brain circuits that brings the consciousness of time alive. So
So
therapists need to be trained to help people to deeply experience the present and to feel the difference between the present and the past.
yeah, so people become actualized when this happens.
Yeah, and we see that very clearly in our current MDMA, psychedelic research, where people are, with these drugs are really able to go, oh my God, that is horrendous. Thank God it's over. EMDR sometimes does that. Hypnosis used to do that very well. So there's various different ways you can get there, but the end result needs to be yes. Yes, it happened, and it happened then, it's not happening now. And to activate those neural pathways, I think we're going to learn a lot about that
Yeah.
still.
And does this recognition of what happened releases like a wave of emotions or another cascade of rememories? Does this happen?
Well, it depends, you know. Like when you do EMDR, which oftentimes allows this to happen, something just happened and people said it went away. When you do,
Disappeared. Yeah.
yeah, it just disappears,
Yeah.
which makes EMDR a wonderful treatment, but in a little bit unsatisfying because you don't get to see like people really come to like, oh my God, it's really like, oh, it's gone. But when you do MDMA treatment, as we do right now, you really see people go into it and come to the realization like, yeah, that's what happened. Yeah, that's what happened. Oh my God. And what then gets introduced is the notion of self-compassion. Because usually when people get traumatized, they hate themselves for having been weak or stupid or ill-prepared to do something about it. So they have this deep sense of shame about something is wrong with me. And what MDMA really helps people to do is to go like, oh my God, I was just a little kid. I was just a little 18-year-old stupid kid. And to really get that sense of who I was back then. So you get a sense of compassion for that creature who was you, who was unable to deal with whatever you're dealing with.
Beautiful, Bessel. It's very inspiring, and I think many of our readers who don't know your book yet will enjoy getting a copy of their book and getting to read it. Is so by the end of your book, you talk about choices people need to take. Do
Yeah.
you could you just mention something about this?
Well, I haven't read my epilogue for a long time, so I don't know
Yes, yes.
what I wrote there. But
What would be the message for you for them today? Just maybe not exactly out of the
well,
book.
I think the big issue is that people do what they do not because they try to make you angry or because they try to game the system. People do what they do because that was their way of surviving. So people who starve themselves, uh, people who have anorexia, uh, develop anorexia in order to deal with something. People who become drug addicts uh, don't take drugs because they want to make fun of the police. They take drugs because they cannot stand the way they feel anymore. And that deep discomfort comes from having been beaten up, raped, neglected, etc. So people start doing these things in order to manage something inside of themselves. And so our job is to help people to manage these things on a deeply somatic sensory level and make it tolerable for them to feel their feelings without having to resort to these old ways of coping, drugs or starving or whatever. Yeah.
Very beautiful. For me, your book really shows a full cycle for anybody interested in the topic of trauma treatment, trauma development, and trauma healing, and how to help by bringing more self compassion and taking the right choices in the choose of tree and the path of recovery, actually. So I would just want to thank you today for your time,
Okay.
and I
Thank you.
hope, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Good
Okay,
luck to you. Take
thank
care.
you.